Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Seneca begins letter 59 by saying to his friend and correspondent Lucilius, I derived so much pleasure from your letter, and then immediately he has to go into a discussion and some distinctions about terminology because, if Lucilius wanted to be kind of a stickler, kind of pedantic, he could say, wait a second, Seneca, you're a Stoic, and pleasure isn't a good thing for Stoics now, is it? And we'll talk about why in just a moment. There's some backstory to this, you could say, or some underlying philosophical assumptions. And notice what Seneca is going to say. You must allow me to use common parlance. That's the way in which ordinary people use the language, the way in which ordinary people use terms. You mustn't recall my words to their Stoic meanings. The Stoics themselves were using terms like pleasure, voluptas, right? Or joy, gaudio, also the verb gaudere, to take joy in ways that were different than the ordinary person would mean them. And this is very common, actually, not just for the Stoics, but for philosophers in general, but particularly for the Stoics. They were well known in ancient times for either making up new terms or in using terms in very, very specific ways. And so Seneca is going to do a good bit of explanation about how it works with real joy, who can actually enjoy real joy, and then, what pleasure is and how we ought to look at it. So he goes on and he says, all right, it's our doctrine that pleasure is a fault. And he's also going to say that joy, gaudio, is just officially for the wise person, the sapiens, or the wise people, the sapientes, sometimes called the sages, right? Pleasure, voluptas, is actually a vice or a fault, a bad thing, a vitium. Now, why would the Stoics say this? Well, because they think that emotions that are not regulated by reason are actually bad for us, problematic, and they lead us into vices, and they're also caused by vices. So, this is a standard doctrine of them. There's actually, and you can look it up out there, 4 main emotional states, sort of baskets that they put things into, and pleasure is one of those. Pain is another one, pain or grief, you could say. And then there's desire and aversion, right? But you can have rational forms of this. And the Stoics actually did distinguish the good emotional states, the eupathe, right? And among them were feeling pleasure in the right way, feeling pleasure rationally, and that's what they call joy. In Greek, charis, in Latin, gaudio. So there's a philosophical underpinning to this. And Seneca says, in our ordinary language, we use this word pleasure, voluptas, for any sort of glad feeling. And hilarum is another term. It's used quite a bit in this letter and in Seneca's works. It's the word we get, hilarity from, and it means something like gladness, cheerfulness, being, optimistic. Adfectionem, affectionem, both are ways of talking about the things that actually affect us, the feelings that we have. So we use pleasure quite commonly for anything that makes us feel good, at least for a while. And then Seneca says, real joy is, he says it's an attribute of joy in the Stoic sense, that it never ceases, never ends, desinere, or turns into its opposite. So what does he mean by this? If we're really having joy in something, that joy will continue, and it's not going to be transformed into the opposite, pain, sadness, things we don't like. So, think about, we're going to look at examples, things that you might take joy in or feel pleasure in, that after a while, either they stop being that way or they actually become unpleasant, right? I'll give you a prime example, not one that Seneca talks about. The person who you think is just so funny and you love to hang around with them, or maybe a comedian who you watch, and then after a while their jokes get kind of stale. You know what's coming next and it's not funny anymore. And then after a while you're like, this person's kind of a jerk. I don't actually like to be around them. They're obnoxious to me. Well, that's an example of a joy that turned out not to be a genuine joy because it transformed into its opposite. And Seneca is going to go on a little bit and say, I wasn't wrong to say I derived great pleasure from your letter, even though the untrained person, the not wise person, the imperatus, the person who doesn't have the right experience, right, may be rejoicing for an honorable reason. So he's using the word rejoice, gaudere, the verb of gaudio there, and for an honorable reason, for something that's intrinsically valuable, honestum in Latin, something that actually is good. The untrained person can do that, but it's not as stable as the joy of the more developed person. So he says, I still refer to their emotion as pleasure. Seneca's not talking in a technical way, because it's unruly and swift to revert to the opposite state, and it's set in motion by a belief in a false good and is uncontrolled and excessive. Now, notice that maybe not all of these conditions are actually going to be met in the person who isn't a wise person, not a sage, but is, making progress in moral development or the virtues, right? It's not going to be the case every single time that their views are that things are false goods. If they want to be virtuous, for example, Seneca thinks that's what's really going to make us happy. So if the non-virtuous person desires virtue, that's not a false good. Uncontrolled and excessive, it's possible for us, at least some of the time, not to go too far with that. And so he says, let me get back to my intended topic and tell you what it was that pleased me in your letter. You have your words under control. And he starts to talk about how we express ourselves. And Seneca says, I find some metaphors, not risky ones, but ones that have ventured out before. I find imagery, and if anyone tells us not to use imagery, deeming it only allowable for poets, I think they must not have read even one of our older writers. And he says that they're full of analogies which to my mind are necessary. And Seneca himself will use examples and analogies and metaphors all the time. And then he's going to praise a particular metaphor by another philosopher, a Roman, who was not a Stoic but seemed to have his own school, Sextius. And he says that the words of his philosophy are Greek, but the values are Roman. I was struck by an image he devised, an army that marches in square formation. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second, because what is the metaphor going to be? The army will actually be the virtues, and the notion of squareness, four-sidedness. This is actually a metaphor that gets used throughout time for the virtues. Why? Well, in part because there's 4 of them, 4 cardinal virtues that the Stoics recognize: wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. So coming back to this metaphor, he says that the wise men ought to do the same as an army that marches in square formation when its anticipated enemies might attack from any direction. He should station his virtues on every side so that whenever trouble arises, his garrison may be ready and may respond without disarray at a nod from their commander. And he says, we need this same promptness or alacrity to respond. In fact, we need it even more. Armies often fear the enemy without reason, but if we think about the vices, we got to be really, really careful. And he says, the wise man is fortified against every incursion. He is determined, will not retreat before the attack of poverty, something we often fear, of grief. Again, something that we may fear, feel aversion towards, of disrepute or of pain. He will advance against them and even into their midst. And then Seneca is actually going to discuss at significant length, how do we screw it up with our pleasures and our joy? Why do we not have the joy of the wise person? And the causes lie partly in the things out there that we're pursuing. And it's not those things' fault. It's actually our fault for, valuing them wrongly. But it's also in ourself, the failures on our own part. So we could say there's a subjective and an objective side to it, if you like that kind of language. He says, as for us, there's many things that bind us, many that sap our strength. We've languished a long time in our faults, our vices, and cannot easily get free of them. It's not merely that we're tainted with them, we're steeped in them. And then he says, rather than using more metaphors, let me ask a question. Why does foolishness have such a tight hold on us? So he's going to bring up a couple things here. Well, we have foolishness itself, ignorance, a lack of wisdom. We also have a lack of courage. Now, this requires a little bit of explanation as well, because we tend to associate courage only with situations that are scary and resisting fear. The Stoics, for each of these 4 cardinal virtues, distinguished sub-virtues, things that fell into the scope of that virtue. And standing up to fear and other unruly emotions, that is indeed part of courage. But other important parts of courage include industriousness or diligence, actually sticking to the things that we say we're going to do. Like when you have a task ahead of you that you don't really like doing, that requires courage from a Stoic point of view, not because it's scary, but because it's boring or it's onerous and you don't really feel like doing it. So he's saying, we don't work towards healing with all of our own strength. We don't persevere. Second, because we don't sufficiently believe the thing that men of wisdom have discovered, we don't take them into our hearts. We only go superficially into it. And he says, how can anyone learn an amount sufficient to combat his vices if he learns only in the spare time left from cultivating those vices? No one goes into any depth. We should be studying philosophy, not only in the spare time we have, but actually instead of indulging ourselves in our vices or making excuses for that, right? And then he says, there's also this problem of self-satisfaction, of thinking that we're okay as we currently are. He says, if we find someone willing to say that we're good people, we acknowledge that description, even though we're not really good. We're not content with a modicum of praise. Whatever shameless flattery heaps onto us, we accept as if it were our due. So we accept it as if it's something owed to us. We accept it as if it's something true, when we know in our heart of hearts that that's not really the case. And so, this is He uses the example of Alexander the Great and how people would kiss his rear end and make up all sorts of stuff. And Alexander says, everybody says that I'm a god, but look, I can bleed. Flattery leads us into all sorts of problems. And then we can talk about seeking joy in the wrong things. So he's got examples of that. He says, you know you're not wise. Why? Because the wise person is joyful all the time, as we'll look at. What about you? He says, if you seek pleasure in every direction and of every kind, then you're as far removed from wisdom as you are from joy. Joy is your aim, but you are off course. You're aiming at the wrong things. You think that you're going to get there with riches, wealth, and accolades, people praising you. You seek joy in the midst of anxiety. You go after these things on grounds they will bestow happiness. Again, we see this hilarum, right? And pleasure, but in reality, they're actually causes of pain. Again, we see real joy doesn't turn into its opposite. If you're really having joy, then it's not going to turn into sorrow, sadness, pain, regret, all of these other things. And he's going to give us some particular examples. Everyone you see is in pursuit of joy, but they don't know where great and lasting joy is to be had. One tries to get it from dinner parties and self-indulgence. Isn't that a case for so many people in our own day? It might not be dinner parties. It might be ordering takeout. It might be stuffing their faces full of candy. It might be drinking. It might be taking other intoxicants that are not good for the body or the mind. Another from elections and crowds of supporters. This could be political. This could also be seeking out likes in social media. It could be whatever you like along those ways. Another from their girlfriend. Another from pointless display of education and literary studies that don't heal what is amiss. All of them are deceived, he says, by specious and short-lived enticements like drunkenness, prime example, that pays for a single hour's cheery insanity with a long-lasting hangover. Or, notice this one, like the applause and acclamation of a large following that costs you great anxiety to both get and to retain. Even after you get it, you got to keep pleasing the crowd to keep that praise, keep that positive affection towards you, even just to keep within the limelight, to hold their attention. So we have a contrast here. How does the wise person do these things? And notice that Seneca doesn't say that he is the wise person. He's just saying, here's what our school teaches about it. So the wise person is full of joy. They are filled with it, you could say. And not just at one moment, as we're going to see, because they are consistent. They have constancy. Joy does not vanish for them. They're also cheerful. Again, we see this term hilarus, right? And they're calm, placidus. They don't need to be wild. They don't need to be crazy. They don't need to always be extreme. They're enjoying a steady flow of joy in their life. And so he talks about steadiness of joy, gaudii aequalitatem, if that's what you actually want. And now here he's going to make an argument to his interlocutor and to us. That's the result of wisdom, sapientia. So if you don't have wisdom, you're not going to get to have that kind of joy. So if you want that kind of joy, what do you need to do? Well, get wisdom. Now, is wisdom enough? Wisdom is connected with the other three virtues. And so Seneca is going to say here, you have reason to desire wisdom if wisdom is always accompanied by joy, but this joy has only one source, a consciousness, conscientia, of the virtues, plural. Not just a virtue, not just virtue, but the virtues. And you can tell that Seneca means this because in the very next line, he says a person is not capable of joy in the full sense unless they're brave, unless they're just, unless they are temperate. These have to become qualities of us and replace the vices that are opposed to them, namely injustice, which could include greediness, right? A lack of courage that we often call cowardice, and a lack of self-control that we call intemperateness. So unless you have these virtues, you're not actually going to enjoy full, genuine joy. You can have pleasure. Pleasure will be fleeting and will turn into pain. If you want to have the fullness of joy, according to the Stoic doctrine that Seneca is articulating here for us, we need the virtues and we cannot do without them. So the argument here is we better start cultivating them.